What's up, YouTube? How's everyone doing today? So today's Thursday, so that means we have Tech Thursday lined up. And for today's installment, my friend here, Tony, which really provides no technical support, but it's kind of like the liaison between myself and insanity from being in here all the time by myself. And for today's episode, we're going to be covering something that a lot of you guys have been asking about, and I know they're very popular these days. So I'm going to give you guys all the ins, the outs, the 101, and how to adjust a Freecoaster. Ta-da! Yeah, I don't even want to see it. So Tony, show how it's done. Grab the Freecoaster. No, he doesn't care. Tony, like myself, is a fan of the cassette, so, you know, he doesn't really care too much about it, as you can see. So yeah, let's dissect this bad boy and see what makes it tick, and then I'll show you guys how to adjust the slack, how to grease it, and anything else you want to know. Alright, so here are some of the essentials. We're going to need a Freecoaster hub, we're going to be using the Merritt Finaldrive, a 6mm Allen key, a 24mm wrench, and some grease. And a napkin to clean up your hands and to degrease the hub. Ready? Let's go. Alright, so adjusting the Freecoaster. Number one, this is a hub. So what it means is that this is the center hub of where all the driving force is coming from your wheel. Obviously, a lot of you guys aren't just going to have the hub laying around, so it's going to be in wheel form. So let me show you guys how it works via wheel form. And the wheel that we have here is the Colony Freecoaster, and it's a pretty straightforward hub. And like I said, I'm going to be showing you the tutorial on the whole wheel as opposed to the hub because that's how you'll be working on it. So let's begin. Number one, remove the 17mm bolt. Okay. Next, place your 6mm Allen on the axle to hold it in place. And then you're going to want to remove this lock nut here. So when doing so, all you need is a 24mm wrench, place it here, and remove it. Okay. Once you've loosened it, remove the lock nut altogether. And, very important, when you're removing things, make sure to keep them all in one pile so that you don't lose anything. The next thing after the cone nut is this washer. And it's kind of like a hat washer, so that means that one side is flat and the other side has a bit of concavity to it, so that means it's kind of like forming a small arch. And the way that it goes is the arch is going to go facing the driver. So keep that in mind, it's important, but for now we'll just keep it in place. And once you've removed that, the next thing you want to do is actually push the axle out, and you can use a rubber mallet, but when they're new, you can almost get away with it using it in your hand. So I've got that man strength, so I'm just going to shove it out using my hands. And voila! The axle comes out with the bearings and everything else. So now let me show you what makes a Freecoaster tick. So we're using the anatomy of the Colony hub as the first Freecoaster, but I also have, like I said, the Merritt, and I'm also going to show you guys the internals of a Shadow Conspiracy hub. So first, let's tackle this. So on the right side, or the drive side, I ride right side drive, so usually the drive side is on the right for me, but if you have a left-hand wheel, then the left side will be your drive side. But for now, let's just keep it simple. The right side for myself, and as you remember, we removed the 17mm nut. We also removed the lock nut. And lock nuts, as you can see, have a smooth side and then a groove side. Usually you want the groove side to be hitting the inner part of your dropout. So whenever you're assembling this, you want the smooth side to be touching a smooth washer. You want the coarse side or the rib side to be up against your frame. And that's what allows it to not shift around. Sometimes I notice that people have hubs and when they're aligning their wheels, it starts shifting. That's usually because you either put this lock nut the wrong way or the grooves are completely gone. And we have the spacer that, like I said, is a hat spacer. So one side is concave, one side is flat. Again, you want the concave side to actually be pushing against the driver, and you want the flat side to be pushing on the back of the lock nut. So it's nice and smooth back here. Then on the left side, or the non-drive side, we have a lock nut that's actually meshed together with the cone nut. Some hubs have a lock nut that's separate from the cone nut. This one comes all in one piece, and we have the other 17mm nut. Now, what makes a Freecoaster tick? So, we have, number one, the driver. So on your cassette, a driver is usually really short and compact, and the driver actually holds the springs and the pawls, which actually make the clicking noise on a cassette. For a Freecoaster, the driver actually has threads, and as you can see, this is actually a really long driver, and it has a lot of threads. So that means that you're going to have more ample room to have your pedal alignment change before it actually engages. This one actually has, I believe, 2 bearings on the inside and it looks like a little bushing. So that's what makes up a Freecoaster driver. Next up, we have this piece. And this is actually called the clutch. And as you can see, the clutch has one smooth side and one side with grooves. And on the inside, it has threads. And the reason for that is that the actual driver threads into the clutch. And that's what allows you to have the distance between your back pedals when you're actually going to free coast or when you're going to engage. And how this works is that there's a part on the hub on the inside. You can't really see it very well, but on the inside of this hub, there'll be an area called a hump. So what happens is when this clutch becomes engaged, this part where the knurlings are on the actual driver will catch the inside of the hub and actually force it to engage. When you disengage it, you're actually adding a distance. So that means that this clutch is not hitting the hub, let's say in this area where the hump is, and it'll allow you to free coast. So again, when it's fully engaged, when it's fully touching, then this part will be touching that part of the hub, and that will cause the engagement. On the other side, we have this area of the axle where there's a hole in the axle, and there's a spring inside of the actual axle piece, and then we have these two little points here. And those are called spring points. So those spring points force the actual clutch to have tension. So the reason that you want these nice and greased is that when you actually put this clutch over these springs, these actually get damaged if they're not fully greased, and that will inhibit them from springing back and keeping the clutch in proper tension, and that'll actually make it so your hub doesn't engage. So a lot of times people blow out their Freecoaster because they actually destroy this little pin. So be very careful when you're using it. Okay? And then on this side of the axle, the non-drive side, we have a bearing, and then we have spacers. And this hub has 3 spacers. Some hubs have more, some hubs have less. Some hubs actually come with a bigger spacer. It all depends on which hub you're using. But for the simplicity of this tutorial, we'll be using one with only 3 spacers. And then last but not least, like I said, you have the axle. This axle actually has 6mm cutouts on both sides. So if you ever strip out this axle, you actually have 2 points for entry so that you can tighten it up or loosen it up. How to adjust the slack. So this hub comes with 3 washers, like I said. The more spacers that you have up against the axle and the clutch, the smaller the gap will be that it can actually travel, and that means that the slack when you're actually pedaling will be less. The problem with that is that the less slack, the quicker it'll engage, so the less comfortable you can be when you're actually going backwards. Some people love a huge gap, so you remove all the spacers. Some people like a very small gap, so you put the 3 in there, and some people are even known to add a few more spacers and keep the slack at a very minimum. And that's cool. Whichever one you prefer is up to you. So let me show you how to do it. I'm going to place the clutch and the driver back on just for this demonstration. Okay, and again, you have to be very careful when you're getting the clutch over these 2 springs. Okay, now it's on there nice and tight. So again, these 2 pins here, as you can see, be very careful when putting them on, make sure they're nice and greased. So again, the 2 pins keep the clutch mechanism nice and centered and floating. If the 2 pins weren't there, then it would be all over the place and it wouldn't engage properly. So now, we're going to remove 2 of the spacers. We're just going to leave 1 spacer in there, and I'll show you what happens. So you put the spacer back in there, comes and presses up against the actual pins, and then you put the bearing back on, squeeze it nice and tight. So now, like I said, there's 1 spacer on the actual clutch. So what will happen is, when you're about to go backwards, you're going to disengage the actual driver from the clutch. It'll push up against the bearing. And as you can see, there's a gap here. So that means that this clutch can actually travel a bigger distance than is even allowed. When there's spacers there, so let's say these 2, when the spacers are actually there, then it'll make it so that it's a smaller distance. So that'll mean that it'll be a quicker engagement, more responsiveness. So again, if you really want to have a huge slack and you don't want to worry about pedal pressure too much, then all you gotta do is just remove that 1 spacer that's left, and it'll be as big of a gap as you can get. Okay, so I removed it. So now we have no spacers, so now we're gonna have a big gap. Put the bearing back on. Again, all this should be done by hand. There's no need to bang anything, so nice and smooth. Okay, now we grab a little bit of grease. Make sure you have some grease on the actual bearings. We're just using a nice multi-purpose grease. These are usually red and they're light. There's nothing too clumpy about them. Again, you put that on, make sure that the clutch goes nice and smoothly over it, and ta-da! And as you can see, all of this working nice and smoothly, and it's ready to go back in the hub. So we got the axle, the springs are nice and greased, and what you're going to do is you're going to place the cone nut and lock nut back on. It's going to take a little while. Okay, and you want to make sure that the lock nut is nice and snug up against the bearing. Okay, nice tight. And then you can actually put the 17mm bolt on here as well. You don't have to, but might as well. I'm going to put this right back in the display. So next up is the clutch mechanism. So how that works is, again, right now they're together. You're going to unthread them. So that's going to be pedaling forward to the right. Now it's unthreaded. You have the knurled side, and you have the smooth side. The knurled side is going to go into the hub facing the driver. So you want the driver to thread into this. Then the smooth side will be facing, let's call it the non-drive side. It'll be facing the actual bearing that's on the non-drive side. So this will drop in. Now you're ready to put the axle in. Again, so the pins should be closest to the non-drive side. Then you have all the open area to make sure the driver and all the lock nuts and spacers are on the right side. Slide that in, be very nice and smooth. Center the bearing here, and then you can either use a rubber mallet. This one is brand new, so I'm going to put a little tiny bit of grease around the bearing here so I can just smoothly push it in. And again, you can use a rubber mallet. I'm going to be using my hands, and it'll slide right in. You want to make sure it's nice and smooth. Wipe off any extra grease. And now we're ready for the driver. So you slide the driver over the axle, make sure everything's nice and centered again, and you basically just thread it, reverse threads, make sure it's all the way in, nice and smooth. Again, the hat spacer with the concave side, so that means like the arch side is going to actually be touching the bearing that's on the driver. And the reason for that is bearings have an area where they have a seal and then they have a race. And the reason that this spacer has an arch is so that it touches right at the race and it doesn't actually push up against the seal and cause the actual bearing to seize or bind. That drops on. Then you get the lock nut. Again, smooth side is going to be touching the back side of the hat spacer. So place the 6mm Allen on the insert of the axle. Grab your 24mm wrench. Nice and tight, but nothing too crazy. And you're done. Place the axle bolt on, and you're all set. And just to give you guys a little more variety, here's the Shadow Conspiracy hub. It's the same thing. I've already removed the lock nut on the drive side. And again, you're just gonna push the axle out through the driver. Again, you can tap it with a rubber mallet. I did this by hand, pushed it out, and then we have the same mechanism. So we have an axle. They actually put a lot more grease on this. We have the spacers that press up against the actual spring pin. We have the bearing, the other cone nut, the lock nut, spacer, and a washer. Very similar mechanism. Let me remove the driver for you guys. Okay. And again, very similar. So we have the clutch here. It's a little shorter than the Colony one. Everything else seems pretty much the same basic concept, except there's like a little bushing here that goes on the axle. This will go in. Again, you want to make sure that the grease is nice and distributed evenly when you're putting it back in. Be very careful when you're putting the clutch mechanism over these two pins. That's why I put so much grease, just to make sure you do. You want to clean off any excess grease or lube off of the actual clutch mechanism where the knurling is, because that's what's going to bind on the inside of the actual hub to cause it to engage. But if you look closely, you'll see again, these spacers are the reason that this gap isn't any bigger. And as you can see, this one has 1, 2, 3 spacers. So the engagement is pretty spot on. So the gap is pretty small because of the 3 spacers. So it'll engage pretty quickly and it means it's very responsive. But put that back in. Make sure everything threads nicely. Either tap this with the mallet, push it right in. Make sure everything's engaged. It engages pretty quickly, it's very responsive. Again, lock nut. And this one doesn't have that spacer here because the Shadow Conspiracy one is a little different. The lock nut itself has an area that's raised a little higher, and that's what's gonna bump up against the actual race on the bearing, and it won't bind on the outside part. Make sure everything goes on nice and smooth. And this one, instead of a 6, you need an 8. So we're gonna place the 8mm Allen here, and then tighten it up with a 24mm wrench. Again, this should be kind of tight, but not too crazy, just nice and snug. Place the spacer and the axle nut, and you're all set. Ta-da! Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for me today. I hope you guys found that tutorial instructional, informational, and entertaining. And like always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll try and get back to you guys, or somebody in the comments will help lead you on the right way. And that's going to be all she wrote for Tony. As you can see, he's out cold. Or maybe not. You'll never know with him. But yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and tune in tomorrow's episode where we are actually going to use Tony like a ramp. Okay, no we're not. You know what it is. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. Peace.